Lord Jesus Christ.
We start with something very concrete in order to appreciate what the Lord is telling us today. And that something is that life is a journey, and we are all travelers in this journey called life. And come to think of it, we are now on the 18th day of the 8th month of the year. The pandemic started officially more or less last March, and now we are on the month of August. And that tells us that in spite of what is happening, life goes on. Our journey goes on. In this journey, we, first of all, have to consider that once we were not totally alone, we had members of our families, friends, even classmates, and now have gone ahead of us. And we hope, because of their faith in the Lord Jesus, they have arrived at the Father's house, where many dwelling places were waiting for them. And we are still on that journey. And we hope that nothing can hinder and be obstacle that we also arrive at the Father's house. In other words, the pandemic is not reason to be really despairing as if it would put an end to our journey. No. Even if without pandemic, our journey comes to an end. In this journey today, we have fellow travelers, although they have existed some 500 years ago, and we refer to the prophet Ezekiel. In the first reading, we find Ezekiel talking to the prince of Tyre. Because he was a very wise person, he was able to amass for himself riches, not by illegal means, but he used his talents in order that he became rich. And he was not condemned because he was rich. He was condemned because he allowed his riches to corrupt him. Does it sound familiar? The gospel reading is also a fellow traveler who went ahead of us in St. Matthew and his community sometime between the year 70 and 80. In order to appreciate the meaning of the gospel for us today, the early Christian community of St. Matthew was composed of former Jews who became Christians and former pagans who became Christians. Because they came from different backgrounds and cultures, naturally they experienced difficulties, dissensions in their way of understanding each other. And the gospel today insinuates that there was another issue, and perhaps that bothers St. Matthew, the issue of livelihood. How could they compatibilize livelihood with the following of Jesus, especially since they were committed to announcing the good news? Let us remember that they were not lonely or alone individuals, but they had families. So naturally, they had to be concerned how to bring up their families. And speaking of families, recently I saw pictures of unemployed jeepney drivers who lined up streets in Manila just to beg for some coins to feed their families. In other pictures, a family was shown now living inside their jeepneys because since they could not pay their rent, they were thrown out of their homes. And in that picture, we see everything. There was a cocinilla, there were clothes everywhere. So here we can imagine also in the time of St. Matthew, the problem of livelihood and the following of Jesus. How could they compatibilize these two realities? So here, St. Matthew brings out Jesus to instruct the early Christian community on this regard about riches. And Jesus says, it is difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. That is not the most important thing. the more important thing in order to understand the gospel is the reaction of the apostles. St. Matthew writes the reaction as they were greatly astonished. In other words, or in Tagalog, it would mean, nagtaka sila, naggulat sila sa sinabi ng Panginoon. Why? Because the apostles were not poor people. They were almost rich. They were in fishing industry. And the fishing industry was one of the occupation that made people bit rich. The other occupation would be the occupation of Saint Joseph, the carpenter. The carpenters were very sought after professionals during the time of Jesus. Imagine the palaces of kings and governors and rulers being filled with the furnitures made by carpenters. So carpenters were not really poor people. So the reaction of the apostles, that they were astonished, revealed that they were not really poor people. And this, the reaction, therefore, brings us to the message that Jesus brings out in the gospel today. That it's not so much about the riches, but the possession or the desire, just like in the first reading. That which corrupted the prince of Tyre was not riches, but the corruption, the consequence that brought upon him because of the riches. What is the reading telling us today? Let's go back to the pandemic. One of the consequences of the pandemic in our lives is unemployment. Businesses are closed and businesses are shutting down precisely because of the pandemic. And how about those who are down the ladder of society, like the jeepney drivers? They are practically unemployed because of that. And therefore, what is being asked of us today is make use of our little riches. When you are on your essentials today, when you have to go out on the street and see someone who might be needing a few coins from you, help that person. Who knows that little contribution you might make would be big enough for the family to feed at least today. So make use of the riches that you have. Be generous, be kind, be like God, compassionate and merciful. We now pray to God our Father for the strength to overcome the lure of material wealth and security. Our response sets our hearts for